Well, I wonder what you are most afraid of. What is it that you've got a phobia about? Going to see some pictures coming up now. Maybe you're afraid of heights. That's called acrophobia. Maybe your fear is enclosed spaces. Claustrophobia. Perhaps your fear is insects. Or maybe you're afraid of snakes. Perhaps you're afraid of dogs. Maybe you're afraid of storms. Well, today, in this Bible passage, we read about the fear of Jesus' disciples during a storm on the Sea of Galilee. Now, at over 200 metres below sea level, the Sea of Galilee is the world's lowest freshwater lake. Rushing down between the mountains, the cold winds will blow in regularly, and they will whip up huge storms on the water. Now, this wasn't news to the disciples in this story. Simon, Andrew, James, and John were experienced fishermen. They've spent countless hours on this lake. They know how rough the waters can be. Yet what actually happens during this particular night out on the lake potentially becomes one of the most terrifying moments of their lives. Now, given their vast experience of fishing, this shouldn't have been the case. But whatever storms they've been through before, this one seems worse. The situation is completely out of control, or so it seems. You see, as we study this story together, we're going to see and understand something more about Jesus. And we'll see very clearly that Jesus has two natures, that he is both fully human and fully God. You see, Jesus has had a busy day, maybe even a busy few days. I'm sure many of us can empathise with that. Crowds of people were constantly around him, wanting to hear what he had to say, wanting to see him perform miracles, and it must have felt really pressurised and stressful to be surrounded by all of that. And so just like any of us, Jesus must have been exhausted. Imagine being constantly followed by crowds, being the focus of their attention all the time, needing to carry on speaking and teaching more and more. You know, all of us, I think, would have been tired, wanting to get some space on our own, needing some sleep, hungry. Jesus was fully human, so he understood all of that. He would have felt all of those things. He knows how we feel in the different seasons of our lives, because he has lived on earth as a human being. He's experienced different feelings, different emotions, different needs. So it's no surprise that as evening draws in, Jesus calls the disciples to take a boat over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And, as we read in verse 36, as they row away, this means they are leaving the crowds behind. Phew. Finally, some peace and quiet, the opportunity to relax, to sit down and rest. In fact, rest so much that as we read in verse 38, Jesus falls asleep on a cushion in the stern of the boat. He must have been exhausted. I think we all know that feeling, don't we? When all we want to do is just lie down and sleep. Maybe that's even been your experience this week. It's a perfectly natural and human response when things have been busy. But as he sleeps, a furious storm comes up. There's thunder, lightning, stormy winds, heavy rain. The sea becomes very choppy. The waves rise up and down, and the boat sways all over the place. In fact, we read in verse 37 that the storm was so bad that the waves were huge and broke over the boat, so that the boat was nearly swamped. How would you have been feeling? To help us enter into the experience of the disciples, we're going to watch a very short video now of a boat. Admittedly, it's a boat that's larger than a fishing boat, but it's a boat struggling in a very big storm. Thanks to our young people for their involvement in that. And I'm sure you can sense yourselves the panic of the disciples in this storm as they rush to wake Jesus up, maybe shaking him physically, shouting at him. a bit of a rude awakening from a deep sleep. And amongst all this commotion comes the cry and the accusation, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Anger, frustration, panic, fear, all in one sentence. The storm is bad enough that they are terrified of drowning. They assume that Jesus being asleep means he doesn't care, and they are panicking big time. They know they need help, proper help. And so Jesus gets up from his resting place, and the rescue from the storm takes place as Jesus brings peace to the troubled sea. We're going to sing together now, My Lighthouse, which reminds us about that peace in troubled seas.
Wow, the storm on the Sea of Galilee was really raging. I don't know if you can see how sort of wet and foggy my glasses are. I just can't see anymore. It's so sort of misty and the rain is lashing, and wow, the storm was incredible, wasn't it? But in the midst of that, in the midst of this terrible raging storm, verse 39 Mike records, Jesus got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Now, who does that? This is incredible. The storm is raging like anything. Who does that? Who speaks to the wind and the waves and they just obey him instantly? It is incredible. The disciples, their mind must be blown by what's going on. If you read the Old Testament, you would know that only God can do that. Now, for example, in Psalm 106, the psalmist is talking about the Exodus, and the psalmist says in Psalm 106, God rebuked the Red Sea and it dried up. So the same idea of God rebuking the water and it instantly obeying. So the disciples are thinking, wow, in the midst of this storm, who does that? Who says quiet, silence? Literally, the Greek word means to sort of be mute, like be muzzled. Almost like you're talking to a pet dog and you just say, silence, sit, or something like that. A bit like me commanding our pet dog, Pepper. Why don't I just introduce Pepper to you now? Pepper, come here, Pepper. This is our dog, Pepper. For those who don't know, Pepper is sometimes called our grandparents' favourite grandchild. Pepper, come here. Pepper, sit. Sit, no, sit. Say please. Say please. That's a good dog, well done. Thanks for helping us out, Pepper. And just like that, the sea was completely calm. Isn't that amazing? Just like talking to a dog, Jesus said to the wind and the waves, sit. If you remember Barbara Woodhouse, Jesus just said, sit. And the wind and the waves sat. Instantly calm. Who does that? That's why it's really sad the way Mark tells the story, that the disciples still didn't trust Jesus. As we've gone through Mark's gospel, they've got so many reasons to trust in Jesus. The demons obey him. His amazing teaching. He forgives sins. He heals people. And yet still the disciples don't quite trust Jesus. Is that you? So we move now to think about our lives. Lots of people have said as we travel through this pandemic together that we're all in different boats. Of course, we're facing different circumstances. What you're going through is not the same as what I'm going through or others. We're all in different boats. But in the pandemic, there is a sense in which we're all in the same storm. We're all going through these difficult things together. Now, like in Mark 4, Jesus comes to us in the midst of that storm, the world that we live in, that is scary at times, where there are storms, there is a global pandemic. I wonder what storm you're facing, particularly because of the pandemic. The COVID virus is putting pressure in all sorts of areas. Many of us, it's our jobs. We're facing storms in our jobs. Maybe there's uncertainty, fear of redundancy, all those kind of issues. Possibly our marriages are under great strain because of the pandemic. If you're at school and you're worried about exams, are GCSEs, are A-levels going to happen? All those kind of storms. And you're in the middle of those storms. And Mark reminds us that Jesus comes to us in the middle of our storms. Are you like the disciples? Do you trust Jesus in the midst of the storm? Or are you still confused and terrified like the disciples? Now, it's important to notice that no miracle means there's no master. In this story, we see that Jesus is the master of the storm. No miracle means no master. And particularly if you're not yet a Christian, you might be reading this story and thinking, well, this is ridiculous. Nobody can do that. These kind of miracles can't possibly happen. But if so, you need to come to think that through and decide whether you think it's possible or not. Whether you believe that Jesus really did this. Because I want you to see that the whole point of this story, the reason why Mark tells this story, is to show that Jesus is the master of the storm. And therefore, if this didn't really happen, it's of no consequence to us. Those storms that I just mentioned, like your job or your marriage or at school, what comfort is it if this didn't really happen? You see, if Jesus really is Lord of creation, if he is master of the storm, then he can be master of your storm. And you can take comfort from that. But if you're going through some terrible storm at the moment, what comfort is it if I just say to you, well, a long time ago, a person told a nice story about Jesus. So if this didn't really happen, there is no comfort, is it? No miracle, no master. But all of this comes down to verse 41, doesn't it? The disciples are terrified, Mark says, terrified. They ask each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Who is this? The central question to our series on Mark's Gospel, like Mark 8, who do you say I am? Who is this? Who is Jesus? Is he, do you believe, the master of the storm? Can he make the water go from this raging storm we saw earlier to what we have now? Completely calm. And the crazy thing is that trust and terror are not incompatible. We know, don't we, that later on the disciples did go on to trust Jesus. But being terrified of Jesus was a step towards trusting in him. Because terror is a right response. The kind of person who has the power to stop the wind and the waves like that, to be terrified of him, is a good response. You cannot trust Jesus until you've been terrified of him first. So that's what we see today in Mark chapter 4. Who do you say Jesus is? Today in Mark 4, he is the master of the storm. And to help us just apply that, Karen's going to lead us in a prayer response time now. So over to Karen. Thanks.